All right, everybody. So in class, we've been talking about the different compromises that had to be made to actually draft the Constitution. And we're going to continue that discussion in class tomorrow. But what I want to focus on for this little activity is just thinking about and talking about what made the Constitution actually controversial amongst Americans and what it actually said. So if you could just take a minute, you can pause the video. I want you to try the activator. See if you can define these two terms, controversial, or three terms, public sphere, and then finally ratified. We talked about that word ratified in class. Once you find those terms, see if you can analyze what the artist was trying to suggest with the political cartoon right here in front of you. Okay. So the first thing to really elaborate on is what we've talked about before. I believe when we did the Enlightenment, we talked about Montesquieu, and Montesquieu argued that government should be made up of separate parts that essentially are not any more powerful than each other. So under the Constitution, we had three branches. We had the legislative branch, we had the judicial branch, and we had the executive branch. Now, this is just an overview of what each of those branches could actually do to the other to check their power. By check, what I essentially mean is that each branch could knock down the power and authority of the other branches around it. That way, no one central authority would become predominant over the others. And we'll talk about over the next couple weeks whether or not that is still the case or if we have deviated from the original plan from the framers. So one of the other things that is much more controversial today, given the last election in 2016, is the Electoral College. So it's a very complicated system, a very complicated philosophy for why we use it. And we're going to explore it a bit more in depth after we come back from winter break. But essentially, here are the nuts and bolts. Basically, on one side, it is argued that the elites feared a popular vote would be divided amongst a whole bunch of different regional candidates. So in other words, if you had, let's say, for example, the election in 2016, when we talked about, there's a dozen or so Republicans running it first. You've got Trump from New York. You've got Christie from New Jersey. You've got across the spectrum, you've got Mitt Romney at some point from Utah, from Massachusetts. I know he ran in 2008. But you could go down a list and basically come up with the point that if that were to be the case, you might have a perfectly split electorate because your people would generally vote for the people who represent their region. So the other thing that people were afraid of was that uneducated majorities could essentially swing the vote. And it's worth mentioning that plenty of bad people throughout history have come into power through democracy, essentially. Although it's complicated, essentially, Adolf Hitler was democratically elected. So it's not impossible for people, especially in large groups, to make bad decisions. So what they came up with was a compromise, where basically we have a system where the individual states, based on their population, get so many electoral votes that can be cast in the Electoral College to determine who essentially becomes president. So I'll show it with a map. This is a breakdown of the 2016 electoral points. So Massachusetts, for example, we have 12. Rhode Island, only 4. California has 55. Texas, 34. Washington, 11. So on and so forth. As you make your way around, what this shows is that each of these states has a very divergent population in terms of numbers, and the electoral points are supposed to reflect that. So this is the electoral map from 2008 when Obama and Romney ran against each other. Although the map looks pretty red, it's important to note that Obama won big states, the ones that carried the most clout. So, for example, New York, Pennsylvania, California. Romney, of course, carried Texas, but Florida ended up being a huge hinging point on who actually won the election. Because look, it's almost 30 points. Whoever won Florida really could be argued would have taken the electoral process. So a lot of people have issues with that today. But what we need to talk about quickly is 200 years ago, what the major debate was about whether or not the Constitution should be ratified. So on one side, you had the Federalists. The Federalists said the Constitution was good. It was important. They wanted a strong national or central government. And a group of them famously wrote the Federalist Papers. And we'll be reading those in class later this week. So you have Hamilton, Jay, and a couple other people who essentially sit down and write out James Madison, detailed arguments for why the Constitution were really important. Now, usually they were written anonymously, which means, they might put no name to it, they might put a pseudonym, and we'll talk about some of those pseudonyms in class, but they were really detailing an argument that people followed in the newspapers. So there's Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. On the other side of the equation, you had the Anti-federalists. These people feared that the Constitution was too powerful. They didn't like the fact that the government was getting so much power and authority in a central capacity. So people like Jefferson, although he wasn't, I guess, technically an anti-federalist, if you think back to the letter that he wrote during Shays' Rebellion, he was fearful that the Constitutional Convention would make a government that was too powerful and that we would become a reactionary government, which we've seen plenty of times. Something bad happens and we overreact, okay? So their theory was that the Constitution was too expansive, too overarching. It didn't give enough individual liberties to the citizen. Not all of the Anti-federalists were convinced that the Articles had actually failed. Many of the Anti-federalists said, well, instead of just throwing out the Articles, why don't we go back and revise it to be a little bit more practical, but at the same time maintain the overarching theme of individual liberty and individual state sovereignty. So the basic points here are summarized in front of you. So if you want to copy these down, in class, we're going to look at some writings from both sides. We're going to talk about what the Anti-federalists said, we're going to talk about what the Federalists said, and we're going to argue and think about where ultimately we have ended up as a country 230 years later. Whose ideas have proved to be more correct given the fact that the Constitution, of course, actually was ratified. So in order to ratify the Constitution, 9 of the 13 states had to actually ratify it on their own. So 9 out of the 13 did, but some of the bigger states like New York and Virginia actually did not ratify them at first. So technically speaking, the Constitution did not go into effect until 1789 when New York and Virginia did. And that's the first time that Congress was actually held when George Washington took office to actually be the first person to lead the executive branch. So, for all of these reasons, the Constitution was a very important turning point, not just for Americans, but for the world. It was a detailed set of rules and laws, essentially, that would govern millions of people. But it wasn't too detailed. There was parts of it that were left purposely ambiguous, like we've talked about in class, and left open to interpretation that we're going to be debating in our own class, right? How do these things manifest themselves today, especially when it comes to the Bill of Rights?